I had been planning secretly for months, and thank God the weather that morning was perfect. April 21st, 2019. After brunch with my partner at one of our favorite restaurants, we walked to the building in Crown Heights where we had met just 5 years earlier. He could have expected what would happen next, given that we'd talked about it for years, but he was overflowing with surprise when I got down on one knee, and shortly thereafter, he said yes. We came home to an apartment filled with family and friends and so many kosher for Passover desserts. It was very Jewish and very cinematic, and all according to plan. But as the season cycled through that year, truths that had existed for a long time became more apparent to both of us. And by December, those truths made it impossible for us to stick to that plan, however Jewish and cinematic our wedding was going to be. After months of painful conversations and after half a decade preparing to one day be married, the two of us decided to separate. Over the past 9 months, I've mourned the loss of a world that I've looked forward to for years. A world that nearly came into being through the vow that I made that morning last April. But a world that I came to feel I had destroyed because I couldn't live up to that vow. Kol Nidre, v'esare, v'charame, v'koname, v'chinuye, v'kinuse ushvuot. The rhythm of that Aramaic is always piercing, but so much more so for me this year. Kol Nidre, all vows, renunciations, bans, oath, pledges, and promises that we vow to ourselves and to God, we hereby retract. Given the choices I made this year, I feel grateful in some ways that our liturgy retracts the commitments we fail to uphold. But even as it invites us to let ourselves off the hook, Kol Nidre still stings. It's a bittersweet recognition that we aren't always able to do what we intend to do. And boy, does that feel real this year for so many of us. 5780 was a year in which all of us have had to accept innumerable vows, promises, and expectations which couldn't be fulfilled. Every one of us here tonight has had to process that the world we had expected last Rosh Hashanah didn't come to be. In some cases, this was out of our control. In others, we had more agency. But the pain of failed expectations has defined so much of our lives in either case. I think about the person suffering from addiction who was certain on January 1st that 2020 would be the year that they entered recovery, but who didn't have the strength to do so after spending all day, every day at home this spring. I think about the woman who left an unsatisfying career this past winter, taking a gamble on something better, only to remain unemployed in the midst of this financial crisis. At the worst possible level, I think about the parents who lost their lives to coronavirus, unable to fulfill their promise to be present at major milestones in their kids' lives. And somewhat more simply, I think about any one of us who planned to do things that felt essential to us this year, but which we couldn't make happen. Whether our unmet expectations were big or small, within our control or not, the eternal possibility that we might fail to follow through was cast into sharp relief this year. And as Viktor Frankl taught, suffering fills a space evenly and fully no matter how little or much there is. Whether our expectations for this year were significant or not, the suffering of not living up to what we wanted was defining. And here comes Kol Nidre, a service built around a text that says, "We hereby nullify all our vows and promises." A prayer that acknowledges that things won't go the way we feel certain that they will in the year to come. It's understandably controversial. Rabbis in every generation since at least the 9th century have questioned the whole premise of nullifying vows on Yom Kippur. After all, it seems counterintuitive. When we work so hard to take our commitments so seriously at this time of year, to announce, just kidding, don't hold me accountable for anything that I say. Many have suggested that the only reason we retain Kol Nidre in our service is that the melody that goes along with the text is so haunting and so memorable. But I'm not convinced. Kol Nidre has more than just its melody to redeem it for us. The truth is that the text actually has nothing to do with the vows we make and break to other people. It focuses on the vows we make to ourselves. And each year, if we can be honest about not living up to our own expectations, the text absolves us from not doing or being everything that we intend, which is so necessary, especially this year. There were countless moments over the past 9 months when I felt certain that I deserved to be in pain because I had failed, because I couldn't live up to what I wanted my life to look like, because I couldn't be who the people I loved seemed to want me to be. And despite the process of apology and forgiveness that I've undergone with the people whom I've hurt, there weren't any clear-cut instructions for forgiving myself, to let go of the fact that I couldn't fulfill the commitment that I had made to myself. And yet, as a person who processes feelings for a living, and also as a hobby, it sometimes feels, I know that forgiving oneself is indispensable to the process of tshuva and moving on. We all know this, but it bears repeating because Yom Kippur is a holiday devoted to doing exactly this, as best we can. By now, we're supposed to have apologized for hurting others and for breaking our commitments to them. Tonight focuses the lens on our commitments to ourselves and invites us to move forward. Perhaps then, starting this holiday with a prayer about the vows we can't fulfill is actually much more logical than we may otherwise have thought. The Torah says specifically that if a man makes a vow to God or an oath imposing an obligation on himself, he must carry out all that has crossed his lips. Not doing what you say you'll do is therefore considered a sin. Ecclesiastes doubles down on this, explaining, it is better to not vow at all than to vow and not fulfill, which is among the more patronizing proverbs of the Bible. When it comes to vows, our classical texts put it bluntly. If you speak, you will be taken seriously, so be careful what you promise. In the Talmud, we learn that the problem with making a vow in the first place is that the action you vow to take assumes the force of a mitzvah. You become obligated to perform it, like performing any other Torah commandment. There is therefore a kind of hubris built into making a vow, creating a commandment for yourself, and playing God with your own life. And unlike the rest of the 613 commandments, which are designed to assure maximal performance, a vow is a commandment without any of the guardrails ensuring its fulfillment. It is a risk. But despite the Jewish hesitancy toward making vows, none of us can live our lives without taking the risk inherent in them. Vows are gambles in hopes of making our lives or the lives of others better in some way, even as we recognize that there are sometimes barriers to our fulfillment of them. And there's no point in doing all the work of repentance if we can't take that gamble with some faith in ourselves to come out on top, at least part of the time. What are the promises or the vows that you broke this year? What are some expectations that you didn't meet? What are the things you did for which you're still beating yourself up? Perhaps this Yom Kippur, it's time to let go a little bit. Tonight, we literally beat our chests, but we could just as easily see that action as holding our hearts, being gentle as we try to make things right with ourselves and with God. As far as God is concerned, it turns out that even God has to break vows from time to time. A midrash from Shmot Rabbah teaches that when the Israelites build an idol in the form of a golden calf against God's will, Moses tries to persuade God not to annihilate the people in retaliation. But Moses, God replies, I already vowed in an earlier section of the Torah to destroy any Israelite who worshipped an idol. I have to go through with it. But then Moses, in peak rabbinic characterization, points out a loophole. He explains to God that according to rabbinic law, a scholar can nullify any vow that was made in vain. So the story goes that Moses dresses up as a judge and God dresses up as a defendant in an imaginary courtroom. And before Moses as judge, God admits regret for vowing to kill the people. And Moses absolves God of this vow. If God can be forgiven for not living up to a vow, can't human beings? If God can get over it, can't we? To paraphrase Ecclesiastes, it's probably better to fulfill the vows that we make. To paraphrase the Talmud, it's probably better not to make vows unless we're somewhat confident that we can fulfill them. But the work of living requires making promises every so often. And the reality of being human is that we will probably break some of them. Yiddish cliches come to mind about life not going according to plan, and all of them resonate in 2020. Sometimes we just can't live up to the cinematic expectations we set for ourselves. When I think about my own experience this year, the truth is that as much as I wanted to live up to the vow I had made, the right thing for me was to break it, to set a new intention for myself, and chart a new course for my life. Since then, I've had to sit with the brokenness and believe that something whole will reemerge through that fragmentation. As each of us sifts through the brokenness of our expectations, whatever those were, may we find a way forward that surprises us this year. As we hear the words of Kol Nidre one last time, as we're about to, may we be gentle toward ourselves about things not going according to our plans. And may we find some way in the next day to offer ourselves a bit of forgiveness. Gemar Chatima Tova.